And we are recording.
I feel like we should have had some waiting music.
That would have been nice.
I should have programmed a song in or something.
The Beatles.
Welcome, everybody. Awesome. We've got quite a few people coming in. Welcome. Good evening, everybody. Looks like we have 14 attendees so far. Thank you, everybody, for being here with us tonight. I think I'm going to start in about 1 minute. Okay, let's get started. Welcome everybody to our Well Life series event supporting your child's multiple identities. Thank you so much for being here tonight. We're quite excited. Before we begin, I want to make you all aware of a few things about the Zoom webinar format that we'll be using tonight. The Zoom webinar format means that participants can only see the speaker and the panelists and will not be able to see each other. The webinar is designed so that you can focus on the speaker, but you can still interact with us by submitting questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You'll be muted during the presentation, but I hope that you will feel free to interrupt Dr. Gaither at any point, and I will read those questions so that we can build in that element for you tonight. So with that being said, welcome. My name is Victoria Pang, and I am a social studies teacher at the Wellington School.
And I'm Brenda Porter, the middle school administrative assistant.
And we are the co-founders of a student group called A Foot in Two Places. A Foot in Two Places is a group for students who identify as having a foot in two places, which can mean a lot of things. It includes students who are multiracial, multi-ethnic, or have other cross-cultural backgrounds. For the past 2 years, we have been bringing together students to have important discussions about identity, empathy for others, and the strengths that we have as cross-cultural background individuals. This year, we're excited to expand our work to include parents. And for several months, we've been connecting with scholars to find the perfect fit, a presenter who could not only explain the challenges, but also the remarkable strengths drawn from having multiple backgrounds. With the kids in our meetings, we call these superpowers. From the first conversation that we had with Dr. Gaither, we knew that she was special. Her research so perfectly aligns with the message of our group and the wider values of Wellington. So I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Sarah Gaither. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology and Neuroscience at Duke University. Dr. Gaither has become a leader in the field of multiple identity and multiracial research, with her work being published in over 40 peer-reviewed journal articles. Dr. Gaither has also garnered media attention, including the New York Times, New York Magazine, Time Magazine, People, BBC, and NPR. It is my pleasure to introduce to you tonight our guest, Dr. Sarah Gaither.
Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. And I'm excited you all made some time. I know this is being recorded for parents and families who couldn't make it live tonight, since I know there are a billion things going on in our lives right now between pandemic, teaching and learning, and the election next week. And so I would love for this to be as helpful for all of you as possible. So please, at any time, if you have questions, please chat them into the Q&A, and we'll make sure that we can do them during my talk. I don't need to sit here and lecture at you for a full 45 minutes. So please do feel free to interrupt me. There are no dumb questions. There are no silly questions. These topics are very complicated. They're very complex. And I find my conversations with parents across my career, actually, these conversations are what leads to new research ideas, leads to new studies that I design in my lab, because it's all of your own lived experiences that really do make sure that I'm being as good of a scholar as I can be, and really capturing how difficult it is to be claiming more than one identity at one time. So go ahead and get started here, but please, again, feel free to type in any questions at all throughout the session. So to sort of kick things off as a little warm-up exercise, since I know all of us just came from work days or teaching and learning days, I want you all to sort of think who you are versus who your child is. You may have the same identities as your child, or you may have different identities than your child, and that conflict, right, on what you identify as versus what your child identifies as is a big theme that I discuss with parents quite often, is sort of how to talk to your kid about an identity that maybe you don't have yourself. How do you make them proud of that identity? When you simply ask yourself who you are, gender is one of those identities that tends to come online pretty instantaneously for most people. It's a very salient social category in our society. Race is the next one that almost always comes up for people, particularly within the last 6 months with Black Lives Matter. Race has become an even more salient topic, particularly for young children who are seeing protest coverage still in the media. Age is another one, culture or ethnicity, religion, socioeconomic status, friend, family member, sexual orientation. You can think of all of these different identities, and what makes it so complicated is each of these identities are individual in some ways, but they intersect with each other in other ways. And that's what makes researching these questions so complicated. And it's also what makes being a human being complicated too. And I don't think we as humans actually acknowledge the difficulty that belonging to multiple groups is. Even though we all have multiple identities, we have this default way of thinking in our society about the fact that we only belong to one group at a time. It just makes things simpler for us. And so that's why I think for children who are growing up with multiple dual identities, whether they're biracial, bisexual, bicultural, bilingual, any of these kinds of dual categories, their existence becomes a little more complex than for kids who aren't growing up with those dual kind of intersecting backgrounds. So those are some of the things we'll be talking about today. So in psychology, this is my big background. There's a huge theory, and I won't get too nerdy into psychology for all of you, but there's a big theory known as social identity theory. And really what this theory has argued for the last 50 or 60 years in psychology is that we all have one in-group and one out-group. And it's that in-group, out-group comparison that really drives all of our social behavior. It drives who we want to be, what types of jobs we want as a young kid, the different types of classes we want to take, whether we want to be a math major in college or an art major. These in-group, out-group comparisons are really how we categorize our world, because our world is so incredibly complex. It's the same way we learn our languages. We learn through categories. You start hearing things that sound similar, and that's how you learn the structures of what language sounds like. This is the exact same thing we do with social categories. However, my big problem with this theory is that it doesn't actually account for the fact that we all have multiple in-groups and multiple out-groups. And so in a paper I wrote about 2 years ago, I've been really trying to push people in psychology and health research and education and policy areas to really consider the fact that we have a multiplicity of belonging. We all belong to multiple groups and categories. And when you're creating a policy or changing something in a classroom or changing how you're teaching something even to your own child at home, you might be targeting one identity that's still actually activating another one at the same time unintentionally, right? And so this is our big problem, is most of our research has not focused on the fact that you can have multiple identities kind of online and taking over your brain in the same moment. So a big reason why I study what I study, for those of you who know nothing about me, I know the Wellington School people know far too much about me at this point, who I've been meeting with over the past few months, is I am biracial myself, even though, as all of you can see, I look pretty white. My dad's Black, as you can see in this picture. My mom's white. Questions I get asked all the time are, is your dad a real Black man? You can see here, he's not a light-skinned Black man. But my childhood growing up was very confusing because I didn't physically match how I looked like my father. So we would be constantly approached in shopping malls and on playgrounds, people asking me if he was kidnapping me, just really questioning who he was and who I was in relation to him. And that can really create a very negative sense of self-development for a lot of kids if parents aren't well versed enough and sort of had to deal with that constant questioning that you and your child might be facing because you don't physically match each other. My brother, as you see here, looks much more racially mixed than I do. And so for me, growing up in this interracial family, I became hyper aware of how differently white and Black people are treated in our society. And also for my brother, he's sometimes categorized as Black and sometimes categorized as white. And sometimes they think he's Hispanic or Latino, even though he's not. And so growing up with him looking more ambiguous than me, it made me really curious, what are the different contexts and situations that causes us to see a racially ambiguous or a gender ambiguous person as an in-group versus an out-group member? I know one of you posted a question about a one-drop rule, which we'll get to later in the talk today. So I wanted to kind of preface all of this with a historical lesson. A lot of my research focuses on being multiracial and multicultural, since that's my own background. So I will be highlighting that a lot in my talk today. But I wanted to make sure you're all aware that being mixed race or being multicultural is not a new thing in the United States. This is a picture of the 1860 US Census, and they had 3 racial categories: white, Black, and mulatto. And yes, mulatto is a derogatory term, but this means that in 1860, we had mixed race people and we actually acknowledged them on our census form. And I think this is really a unique part of history because this was part of the time when we were trying to maintain the status quo for white people, maintaining the power with them, the access to land, the access to rights. That's why we had this 3rd category, because they weren't allowed to be landowners, right? This one-drop rule of categorization was very much in place during slavery, and that's the same visual processes we'll talk about later today. So this category has come and gone across the US Census, and it wasn't until the year 2000, so just 20 years ago, that's the first time in modern day history that people were actually allowed to mark more than one racial box on their census form. So I think this is really telling to also show all of you how constructed race in particular is in our society. We have defined what being white and Black is and what being mixed race is, and we can always deconstruct that at the drop of a time. This is more commonly what you all probably see now as demographic forms. And what I want you all to think about, for those of you who have kids who are multiracial or multicultural, is this red wording I highlighted here at the top of this form. So what is this person's race? Check 1. This forced choice, right, of choosing one of your identities over the other is such an incredibly common stressor for people who are multicultural and multiracial. Forcing you to choose one parent over the other, forcing you to choose one language over the other, one heritage. It's a complete stressor, and I'll show you some data later in the talk that actually shows some of the health consequences that come from this constant identity denial and identity questioning that lots of children with dual identities are unfortunately facing in our society. So until our forms start becoming more inclusive and more representative, these are the types of triggers that your children are all going to be seeing in their forms when they're applying for college, when they're applying for jobs. I even, on one of my faculty job applications just a few years ago, was asked to rank my races as number 1 versus number 2. Who's in first place and who's in second place? I kid you not. So this is a practice that we see everywhere that unfortunately has very strong negative impacts for people who belong to multiple groups. And here's a projection. Some of your questions were asking which populations are growing the fastest. And so this is some statistic projections using US Census data of how the population growth is actually going to be changing from 2010 to 2050. And so even if you're not good at reading graphs, what you'll see here is that the yellow bar is actually going in the downward direction, right? And so that yellow bars are non-Hispanic white people or our typical white people. That means they're actually estimated to be decreasing numerically over the next 30 years going forward. But every other bar is actually in the positive direction, which means all other racial and ethnic minority groups are projected to be increasing. But importantly for my work and for many of you with your own multiracial children, That red bar at the end is the fastest growing youth population in the United States right now. Interracial marriage is on an all-time high. So there are many more multiracial children growing up now, which I actually think makes it a much more positive and socially belonging type of context than when I grew up. I am 36, just to date myself. There were not multiracial toys when I was growing up. Mariah Carey, my only multiracial idol, who was sort of out with her multiracial background. And so I do think this is an exciting time because of the numerical changes that we're seeing for the multiracial population in particular. So I want you all to sort of think to yourself on when did you know your race? This is a question that really tends to spark when kids' racial and ethnic and cultural identities. I would argue also religious identities. I know a few of you were interested in those things as well. What was the specific encounter that you had that caused you to think about your cultural background? And so there's these two terms that I think often get conflated that I wanted to make sure we were all clear on: racial versus ethnic identity. And so first, your racial identity is really this socially constructed system of classifying individuals according to how they look. Right? It's the physical characteristics that we're usually using to categorize someone. But remember, my white face here, I am part Black, but I look very white. So you can see how these social constructions and definition of race can become quite complicated for kids who might not fit stereotypically what a biracial person is supposed to look like. In contrast, your ethnic identity is really people who identify with each other on the basis of some sort of nationality, shared cultural traditions. This is more often religion, linguistic tendencies, things of that sort. And so culture is all the knowledge and values shared by a given society. So these could be your family roles, your family practices. And so when kids are either multicultural versus multiracial, some kids could fall into both of those categories, but some kids might only be multicultural, only be multiracial. And so you can all think which terms may or may not apply to your given situations. So the stages of racial identity development, to build off of that question of when all of you first knew your race for the first time, I would argue these stages actually apply to almost any identity, particularly marginalized identities in our society. The first one is what we would call with pretty young children, the pre-encounter stage. And this is when you're really not consciously aware of what race is. You don't really understand the concept. But again, most of our identities, religion, etc., you're not quite aware of those things and what they mean to you, particularly at a societal level very early on in development. The second stage is considered that encounter stage. So that's when you've actually experienced something that has caused you to really recognize the fact that you belong to X group. That's why I think these stages really map onto things like religion. They realize they went to a synagogue instead of a church when the kid was over at their house, right? These comparisons or these encounters can create this salience for kids for the first time. And that causes kids to then reassess themselves because now they've learned that they're different in some way, shape, or form. Now that encounter can be negative or positive, right? It could be a negative discriminatory type of experience, or it could be a positive celebration. They're realizing something about themselves. The third stage is the immersion stage. And this is once a child has sort of adopted whatever this identity may be, and they're really immersing themselves and wanting to learn more and more and more about that background. And then the final stage is the internalization and commitment stage. And here, this is when you're really internalizing that sense of self as it relates to your racial identity in this case. You're adopting certain traits, certain behaviors, certain beliefs, or cultural practices. Once you've sort of internalized and committed to it, that then becomes a more firm part of your identity. And it's really not until the ages of around 5 or 6 that race and ethnicity becomes super important to kids. And it all is highly dependent on how much parents at home and teachers at school and the media are socializing a child about their racial or ethnic background. So how racial minority identities develop can be a little more complicated than for white or majority children in the United States. And this is because achieving a racial group identity is difficult without having proper socialization agents. And being a minority child, they're growing up in a world where they're unfortunately still learning, even today in 2020, that white is considered the good and superior race. They learn this through who is featured in the media all the time, who gets to run for president. Again, we have 2 white men running for office again on Tuesday. So they see these things and they learn what is considered successful and good and beautiful and amazing and smart in society. And this can make things particularly difficult for racial and ethnic minority children. So minority children, because of this, are actually a lot less likely to show strong in-group preferences early in development. So most kids would love people who look like themselves, want to be like people who are like them. But when you're growing up in this pro-white bias kind of context, unfortunately, those systems are teaching these children not to value how they look, not to value how their hair is, not to value what color their skin is. And that's why, again, this question of forcing children to choose one identity over the other can be so incredibly damaging for their mental health outcomes. When you think about biracial identity development, it's similar in some ways, but different in other ways compared to monoracial or monoethnic children. And this is, again, because most of our identity frameworks are really centered around having one primary racial in-group. It becomes really complicated for doctors and teachers and everyone to sort of consider, well, you're Asian and you're Black? I don't know what to do with you. Do I send you to the all Asian affinity group? Do I send you to the all Black group? These are questions I get from parents all the time, is which affinity group should my child go to? Should they only go to a multiracial group? Is it okay for them to go to one of what we would call their parent monoracial groups? These are the types of questions and experiences that biracial and bicultural kids face quite often. That causes, again, this kind of identity crisis or this identity choice that they're constantly having to make across development. So biracial children are often exposed to two racial groups. I would say one big bias in the field right now across sociology, education, psychology, is most of the work we have, unfortunately, represents only biracial children from two-parent households. So we know a lot less about identity development for a biracial child who's growing up with just one parent that reflects one of their racial backgrounds. So if any of you have questions on that, happy to take those, but we just know far less about that particular population. And research really highlights biracial kids' abilities to identify flexibly, right? And I'll show you some evidence from our lab on things that we've shown, particularly with learning flexibility in children. So one first study that I ran that really—
Can I interrupt for just a second? So we had a question that was submitted before the talk that I thought might be relevant now. And that's the question of, is there an age where having multiple identities might be the most difficult for children? I know you talked about those stages.
Yeah, so it's hard. I think some of it would kind of depend on which identities are sort of in play or at question. Adolescence is a really tough time, regardless of how you identify. But we know right before adolescence, so between the ages of 7 and 10, I'd say 8 and 10, that's when name calling and bullying and all of these kinds of social experiences for kids, particularly in school settings, tend to rise pretty dramatically. So I would actually say the 7 to 10-year-old range is a pretty critical period to make sure your kids have good coping mechanisms for if they are facing any of those types of questioning in a school environment. So 7 to 10 is a big one. Adolescence is another big one as well, mainly because that's when you start dating, you start driving, you're sort of starting to develop your more independent sense of self from your parents. And so adolescence is another time when we see kids struggling a lot with sort of figuring out who they are and what they are and sort of where they belong. The next stage, not to freak all the parents out on this call, is college. And the reason I say college is because it's the first time when most people are leaving their homes, right? They're leaving their homes, they're leaving their families, they're leaving their friend networks, and they're now actually introduced to a whole new world that might be more inclusive or less inclusive than where they came from. But they're also going to be exposed to student groups and student activities that maybe reflect identities they could have. Those are kind of the three main, I think, developmental time points that I think are pretty important to make sure you're having conversations with your kids.
Thank you, Dr. Gaither.
Yeah. So one of the first studies I ran was actually looking at biracial babies. These are actually 3-month-old biracial infants. And yes, that means race is actually salient to your child that early on in development. Now, they don't know what Asian and white means, but they can see the physical differences, right? They're learning through those categories. And there's a big thing in psychology known as the other race effect. And all this means is that you're really good at distinguishing faces from your own racial group. Because of usually your lack of exposure to people who are different, you're not as good at distinguishing people from other racial backgrounds. So if you've heard the phrase, all Asian people look the same, or all Black people look the same, that is the direct remnant from this other race effect finding in psychology. Most of the findings that have shown this have really focused on monoracial children to date. And they've also focused from children from orphanages, actually, who have had very little exposure to people who are different around them. And so there's some conflicting results that actually show if you're a minority child growing up in a predominantly white neighborhood, you actually don't develop the same other race effect because, again, you're then exposed to lots of white people instead of lots of Black people. And so the question I had was, what about biracial children who are growing up in these diverse two-parent households from two different racial backgrounds? Do they see faces from other races the same way? And so what we did in this study was this eye tracking study. And eye tracking is a really fancy TV screen that actually is able to record how long your baby is looking at different things. Super fun to get your kids involved in studies. So I encourage you all to do it because you'll learn a ton about your own kids. Really what we did here is they'd see the picture at the top of the screen over and over and over again until that baby gets really, really bored. And this is called habituation in infant studies. After they get really bored, and I'll show you an example of this in a second, they then see two faces side by side. And the babies are then supposed to look and compare them. Now, if they can tell the difference between the two faces on the bottom of the screen, this is known as a novelty effect, and they should actually stare longer at the face that they weren't just made bored with. This also shows that they're able to tell the difference between those two faces. So we're looking at looking time in this study. So here's a video clip of data from one of these 3-month-old biracial babies. As the dot gets bigger on the screen, that's actually showing where the baby is focusing. And so here you see the baby is looking at the eyes. These are these cute little attention getters that come between the stimuli to get the baby's attention again. So we're at the end of the habituation phase, or at the end of making the baby very, very bored, looking at the same face over and over again. Then after this attention getter, you're now at the test phase trial. And so here you'll see that this baby is actually now scanning very nicely between both of these faces, comparing the two features. And so here is when we would actually look at how much time they're looking at the same face versus the new face. And so if a kid, again, is able to distinguish them, they should look at that new face longer than the original face. What we ended up finding in this study is that biracial infants actually scanned and distinguished these faces faster than monoracial infants. So this means that they're able to tell the difference of those faces with less effort. Now, that sounds like, again, biracial kids are superpowers as you put them here at Wellington School. They don't stay ahead forever, right? But we are seeing this slight boost, again, because of this diversity exposure that biracial infants are getting, that monoracial infants are not getting. But at least across the first 3 months of life, we're seeing that these biracial babies can actually distinguish faces from different races a bit better and a bit more efficiently. Some other ways we've looked at this is with slightly older biracial children. And what we know from a lot of research is that children prefer to learn from people who are similar to themselves, whether that's gender or accent or race. And we know that monoracial children, of course, have one racial in-group who they usually prefer to learn from, but biracial children have two, right? And so my question was, if you have two racial groups, does that mean you have an advantage then as a biracial child in who you're willing to learn from? Does that make you more flexible? Or on the other hand, does it make you less flexible and that you actually need a multicultural teacher in order to learn effectively? So what we did in this study was we recruited 246 kids from the Boston area. This was when I was in grad school. And so we recruited white kids, Black kids, Asian kids, biracial Black, white, and biracial Asian white children. And they completed a few different tasks, which I'll walk you through very briefly. So here what you'll see is a coloring task. So we wanted all children, regardless of their racial background, to really think about their racial identity before we did the other tasks. So they would get a gender matched picture, one of these, depending on if they identified as a boy or a girl, and it was matched to their racial or ethnic identity. And they were given the Crayola crayon multicultural set to color it in to make them look like themselves. For our biracial children, half of them were given a white picture, and then half of them were getting a picture that reflected their minority identity, whether that was Asian or Black. So all kids were thinking about their racial identity. We then brought them into a task where we showed them different short video clips of teachers from different racial backgrounds that would demonstrate how to use really random objects. So for example, I would say, here's how one of my friends uses this toy. And then I'd say, here's how my other friend uses this toy. And usually people laugh when they see her hit her head. I don't know why, and I can't hear you laugh, so it's very strange to me right now. But after this, we would then hand, that's actually a knee pad. We would hand the knee pad to the kid and we'd say, so how would you use this toy? And then if that child either flicked the strap or put it on their head, that would tell us that that's the teacher that they prefer to learn from. We did all the fun, what we call counterbalancing in psychology. So half the time the white teacher would hit it on her head, half the time the Black teacher would do that, and vice versa, to make sure there were no biases and how fun some actions may be over others. So what we ended up finding in the study is that biracial children were super flexible in who they were willing to learn from. When you made one of their racial identities salient or active, when you reminded them of one of their racial identities over the other, that boosted their abilities and willingness to learn from a teacher from that same racial background. For our racial minority mindsets, though, this is what I found really interesting, is that for our biracial kids, if they thought about their Black or their Asian identity respectively, they actually were more willing to learn from a minority teacher than the monoracial minority counterparts. So a biracial Black-white child thinking of their Black identity chose to learn from a Black teacher much more often than a monoracial Black child. And again, we think this is because of that same pro-white bias I mentioned earlier. And again, growing up in a household with two parents from two different racial backgrounds, biracial kids are getting more exposure that it's okay to learn from people who look differently, right? So we were really excited about this data to sort of show there's perhaps an advantage in some learning contexts for biracial children. And again, this white identity also still boosted their preferences in learning from a white teacher as well. So we saw it in both directions, the minority angle and the white angle. And here are those data just to show you in case there are any scientists on the call tonight. But what you see here is our biracial Black-white children, again, chose to learn from teachers that are Black significantly more often than our monoracial Black children. And then the other side of that graph, you see the same things here. Our Asian white children were significantly more likely to want to learn from an Asian teacher compared to monoracial Asian children. So this is, again, showing this learned biases that kids are getting from our society and who they consider are the best or most effective teachers. One way that this connects in some other contexts that I know some of you belong to this demographic as well is for transracially adopted children. So we actually use the same exact paradigm with transracially adopted children. And I see the question here in the chat. Yes, that's a great question. So the question, in case you all can't see it, is when you refer to biracial, are you referring to the biological makeup of the child, not necessarily the two parents in the household who are different races? For example, we are white parents with a Black and biracial children. Our children aren't seeing two parents of different races, so are they really biracial? So that's a great question. Depending on how different scientists are sort of defining things, how we tend to recruit kids for our study is kids themselves biracial because each of their parents belongs to a different racial background. We've never had a large enough sample of kids who they themselves are biracial because their biological parents were different racial backgrounds, but they're now living in a different family context. So our samples have never been as large for that, but this transracially adopted stuff will tie into some of that here, as you'll see in a moment. But on average, I think when most people are defining the word biracial, they mean the child is from a household with two parents from two different racial or ethnic backgrounds. So that could mean that one of the parents could be multiracial themselves. I hope that answers your question. So we know that parental and community support of biculturation and adoptees can support positive ethnic identity for transracially adopted children as well. And I'd say this definitely falls in line with the question that we just got, in that if you're raising a child that's a different racial background than yourself, as long as you are giving that child a positive sense of self, they could still be very proud of their biracial identity, even if you yourself are not biracial or don't match any of the racial identities that your kid may have. So we ran the same exact learning type of study that I just showed you with Chinese adoptees and white Canadian families in the Toronto area. And we actually showed there that they had flexible learning preferences as well. So even within a transracially adopted environment where their parents are still the same race, the key thing here is that for Chinese adoptees in Toronto, they do something very different than we do here in the United States. They actually have mandated Chinese school on weekends. So it's kind of this forced bicultural exposure, bilingual training that all of these children are getting. So they're really getting more of this bicultural, biracial exposure as our biracial kids did in the other study. So again, you can think flexibly about your own family situations on how it is you can expose your kids to all the different things that make them them, even if you don't share that same identity with your child. So some positive biracial, bicultural identity outcomes, just to highlight some of the other things that we know. We know from a lot of research that biracial kids and biracial adults really have learned, because of growing up in these diverse environments, to empathize with both of their backgrounds. It can also buffer effects from stereotypes. So you can actually choose to turn one identity off and on yourself to serve as a buffer during a form experience of prejudice. And we also know that kids with these different backgrounds are able to function more effectively within different types of diverse environments. So they feel more comfortable in all kinds of interracial interactions compared to monoracial people. Again, because of that extra practice they're sort of getting in code switching or frame switching between their different identities. So there are tons of negative outcomes, of course, as well. And this is some data from the Pew Research Center that shows the percentage of people who are multiracial who have ever experienced being a subject to slurs or jokes, poor service in restaurants or other businesses, or being unfairly stopped by police. So multiracial people are still facing a lot of discrimination in our society. As you can see here, Black, American, Indian mixed race people tend to be on the higher end, followed very closely by biracial white Black individuals reporting the highest rates of these negative experiences. But there are two things that lots of people face who aren't necessarily biracial or bicultural. They could just be ambiguous looking in general. And these are the questions: what are you and where are you from? These questions can be very threatening. They can also be very ambiguous in nature too, because sometimes when someone asks this question, it's coming from a very good place, right? Someone actually genuinely wants to know where you might be from. Other times it's not coming from such a good place, right? They think your child looks exotic or whatever the case may be, and it's a very negative experience. But these are things that we know lots of people are facing in our society right now. So there's a study that we ran in the lab, which was one of the meanest studies I think I've ever run. My undergraduates at Duke loved running this study. And what we wanted to look at was how these specific identity denial experiences with college students affects biracial people. And so I'll show you a video clip of this study in a second, but let me set the stage for you on how this study worked. As I mentioned, this question, what are you? Being forced to choose one of your racial identities over the other is one of those very long-term health stressful kinds of situations. And so here we recruited multiracial people and Asian American people, so two different groups, bicultural and biracial. We know that bicultural people, particularly Asian Americans, are often forced to answer the question, are you American or are you from here? So they constantly have their American identity denied, very much like a biracial person usually has one of their racial identities denied. There's been tons of work on Asian American individuals being excluded from nationality discussions. So we were using them as sort of our comparison group in this study. So here, this biracial participant, as you see here, she was recruited for the study. She didn't know it was because of her biracial background. She shows up to the study. She's about 45 minutes in. She thinks this study is just about health because we're actually taking saliva samples from all of our participants in this study to measure cortisol. And cortisol is a biological marker of stress that you will see spike within your bodies whenever you have a stressful experience. And what we know long-term is that people who live their life at higher cortisol levels or experiencing more cortisol spikes tend to have all kinds of negative health-related consequences later on in life: difficulty sleeping, weight gain, early death, all kinds of mental health issues. Cortisol is very much correlated with a lot of these outcomes. So what you'll see here is this biracial participant is about 45 minutes into this study. You're going to see one of my experimenters come in, a white man, and he's going to look at his form and question her racial identity. So take a listen here, and then I'll fill you in.
Based on the study that you completed before coming in, you actually have to be white for this health study.
Oh, I'm Asian and white. What did I put? I'm biracial.
Well, because you already started the study, I guess it's okay if we continue, but I'm gonna have to make a note
someone
of
not
that
screen me?
in the record. Sorry, I'll just make a note of that really quickly. Hold on. All right.
I definitely put that down. So I think didn't you ask a question about like if you're biracial, what are you? And I definitely.
We'll continue this then.
Okay.
So hopefully you all got the gist from there about how stressful the situation was. I mean, she was pretty calm in her demeanor, right? But she kept wanting to confront the experimenter and confirm with him that I did mark things honestly on my form, and you're just the wrong one that's forcing me to say that I'm not actually white, even though I am white. So importantly, in this denial condition, all of the participants were allowed to continue the study, just like you saw at the end of this clip. And what we ended up finding in this study is that both our Asian American and our biracial participants all showed an increase in cortisol, as you would expect, because this is a very identity threatening type of experience. But what we ended up finding was that at recovery period, so when your cortisol comes back down to bring you back to your normal levels, that actually happens faster for biracial people than for bicultural Asian Americans. And so at first glance, you think, oh, maybe that's another superpower for biracial people. Actually, no. What we know is that when people are facing a lot more discrimination, they end up building up coping mechanisms as a way to bring their cortisol back down. And so we actually think that this is evidence that biracial people are facing this type of identity denial so often. That's why they're actually recovering from the stressor a bit faster than our Asian American comparison group. But we all have multiple identities. And so the next part of this talk is really for all of you who are not necessarily multiracial, but can really think about harnessing the multiple identities that your kids have. There's tons of research and creativity, research and education fields that show that creative processes occur more often when we consider multiple perspectives. When you literally think outside of the box, that's when you actually are able to see a new problem for a new way that you've never seen before. And so what I wanted to do in this first study was to look at the fact that I knew multiracial people were flexible from some of the other work I had done. So I recruited multiracial people and monoracial undergraduates, and I had them randomly assigned to either write about their racial identity and what it means to them, or their average day. And so for our multiracial sample, they were writing about their multiple racial identities, but our monoracial sample was writing about their singular monoracial identity. We then had them do a remote associates test problem, which is coming up with a fourth word that equally associates with all three of these words. So here, the fourth word would be house, for house paint, dollhouse, and house cat. And so this is one of those classic creativity measurements that measures how flexibly you can think in finding the associations between these words. And so I was predicting that reminding a multiracial person about their multiple racial identities would actually boost how they were thinking about these words and being able to solve more of them. So that's what we actually ended up finding exactly. Only when we reminded multiracial people about their multiple racial identities did we find this boost in the word problem solving. Not reminding them of their multiracial identity, they performed just the same as a monoracial person in either of those two conditions. Now, knowing that a multiracial person could do this and knowing that we all have multiple identities, actually then replicated this study with another monoracial sample. Only then I asked monoracial people to think about all the identities that they have, all the multiple identities being an athlete, a student, a brother, a friend. When you remind a monoracial person that they too have multiple identities, you find the same boost in performance on the same exact word task. So again, this is harnessing a new way of thinking about yourselves. And for people who are multiracial or multicultural, we perhaps have a bit more practice with it, but everyone, regardless of your background, can show these same benefits. We've also tested the same exact question with younger kids, so ages 6 to 7, is when kids become much more capable of more complex thinking. So there were 3 conditions we assigned kids to. The first one was an own multiple identities condition. So here we'd say, look at this girl in the park. She's a drawer and she's a friend. And then I would turn to the child and I'd say, so are you a drawer? Are you a friend? And I would go through 8 different identities with the kids. And I would end it with, wow, you're a lot of things at the same time. Can you tell me what it feels like to be lots of different things at the same time? And most kids would say it's awesome or it's normal. A few kids said it was tiring or exhausting. But this was really to get kids, again, to think outside of the box that they too have multiple identities. Our other comparison groups were a multiple physical traits condition. So here we'd say, look at this girl in the park. She has 2 arms and 2 legs. And then we'd ask the kid, do you have 2 arms? Do you have 2 legs? So this way that child has multiple things, but it's not identity specific, right? It's just things that you randomly have. And our last condition was, look at this girl in the park. She's a drawer, she's a friend. So hey, little kid, is she a drawer and she a friend? We only reminded the kid about her identities. The kid would never self-reflect on their own multiple identities as another condition. We had a bunch of different tasks that the kids did. I'll only show two of them to you today. The first one is known as a functional fixedness task in psychology. And this is measuring how flexibly kids can think about finding a new function for an object. So here we would say, Mr. Bear really loves honey, but he doesn't have enough Legos to get to the beehive. So what do you think Mr. Bear can do in order to get to the beehive? Here, if you were thinking flexibly, you would see a new use or a new function for that bowl. That bowl you could empty, flip it upside down, and stack the Legos on top, and he could use it as a stool. And so kids in our multiple identities condition solve this problem about 60% of the time. And kids in our other two conditions only solved it about 25% of the time. So a big boost in being able to flexibly problem solve here. We also were really interested in how the same flexible mindset would shift how kids are thinking about different social categories. So in this task, we would put 16 photos on the table in front of the child, and we would say, look at all of these people. Can you put them into any groups that you see? And so we would count up the different ways that kids were actually thinking of the different groups. And they would move the photos around into different groups they saw. We would always end each trial with, do you see any other groups? And what we found here were that kids, again, in our multiple identities condition, would come up with about 6 to 8 ways. Sorry, I don't know why I'm coughing so much. 6 to 8 ways to actually group these photos. Kids in our other two conditions would only come up with about 2 to 3 ways of grouping them. Importantly, all kids were still seeing race and gender. So a multiple identity mindset is not making kids gender blind or color blind. All the kids in all of our conditions all were categorizing these spaces by race and gender. But our kids in the multiple identities condition were the ones who actually saw different types of categories, such as the amount of white space behind their heads in the photos, for example. So a really cool way to show that thinking about your multiple identities, which is again, not our default in society, can expand our sense of self and expand the different social categories that we see in our world. The last part here is some perceptions of ambiguity on sort of how it applies to this one drop rule and how kids are actually processing racially ambiguous, or I argue gender ambiguous spaces as well. So I'll play a little game with you all, and I want you to think about what 2 categories you see with the next space that I show on the screen. So I hope you're all ready. So here comes the first space. Hopefully all of you with our election mindset on right now are knowing that this space is merging Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, right? So this is a morph of those 2 people here. Now I'm going to show you another face. So I want you all to think of who this next person is. And most of you probably are thinking Sarah Palin in your head, but that was actually Tina Fey. And this is Sarah Palin. And the reason that happened to most of you on this call, because I've done this a billion times, and I know this is how it always works, is because I primed or made your mind think about presidential candidates before I showed you the next picture. So thinking of Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton caused you to think of those things. So when I showed you Tina Fey playing Sarah Palin, that is still the category that's very salient in your mind that shifts how you're going to see that person. Well, racially ambiguous categorization works the same way. We look for different cues in a face, whether it's someone's hairstyle, the nose shape, the skin color. It's also how you talk, right? Your accent markers, those dialect markers can also shift how it is someone is categorizing you. And so we did a study actually asking some young kids how they would describe some racially ambiguous children. So here's one image of a biracial black-white girl that we showed kids, and we simply said, can you describe her and what she looks like? One kid said, she's a little bit of darkest peaches. And another kid said, dark, and she might bite me, her mouth is open. Keep these 2 things in mind. This is a boy stimuli that we showed. Here, a child told us he looks like toast. And another child said, he is a little bit of black because he does not look nice. And so I pulled these quotes purposefully, of course, to show you, A, there's a big trend right now in society of teaching kids all kinds of different color words, such as peaches and toast, as a way to describe skin tone and do skin tone exploration. So we are seeing that here in the trends. But you're also still seeing what we would consider that one drop rule, that kids are seeing these kids' faces as part black and as part dangerous, right? He doesn't look nice, and she might bite me. So we're seeing these same one drop rule categorizations being applied here as we do with adults in many contexts. So I was really interested on what actually shifts kids, particularly white kids who are more high status in our society, to see racially ambiguous faces more often as white, they're in group, or as Black, they're out group. Since we know that seeing something in common with someone else can drastically improve a social relationship. So we know that adults remember racial outgroup and racially ambiguous faces pretty badly. So a white adult would remember a Black face just as poorly as a racially ambiguous or a racially mixed face. But we weren't sure when this tendency sort of develops in children. There's also a big thing in developmental milestones known as essentialist reasoning. And if you're very essentialist, this means you think very fixed in your social categories. We also know that when kids think about essentialism or they gain this essentialist reasoning, it correlates very strongly with kids starting to apply stereotypes to other people as well. So one clear example of essentialism is once you're born Black, you're Black forever. Once you're born white, you're white forever. So we were measuring racial essentialism in this case to see if that was the developmental marker that once kids sort of understand how race functions, is that was causing a white child to then see that ambiguous face more often as Black or as the outgroup. So what we did here, we recruited 74 white children, showed them Black faces, racially ambiguous faces, and white faces, as you see here on this screen. And we ran them through a simple memory paradigm. They would see the face, it would go away, and then they'd have to tell us which faces they saw before at a test trial. And these kids were early elementary school age. We also had them complete a racial constancy task to measure that racial essentialism. And so here, this was a much longer task, but the young boy in the middle, we would say, when this boy grows up, who is he going to look like? And so this is a measure of, is race stable or not? And I realize this sounds like a very silly task to most of you on this call because you are all well past the racial constancy development stage. But for kids who don't really understand how race works, we do have kids often choosing the Black man that this white kid is going to grow up to be. We always ask the kids for their reasoning at the end. And so, for example, a kid that says, oh, he'll grow up to be the dark man, we'll say, well, why do you think that? And some kids will say, well, Harry Potter magic, you can turn the lights off, a paint bucket could make the kid dark, all those things could do it. So that's showing that they don't really have a firm understanding of how race functions in our society. On the other hand, kids with this racial essentialist reasoning basically look at you like you're an idiot when you say, who is this kid gonna grow up to be? They'll say, oh, the white man because he was born white, duh. Literally, kids got a lot of attitude with us in this study. So very clear-cut categories in which kids sort of understood what race was versus which kids were still sort of learning what that is from society. What I'll show you here is the memory for these racially ambiguous faces in this study. Blue bars is going to be how well these children remembered white faces. Red bars, those racially mixed faces. And green bars are going to be Black faces. First, what you see here are kids without that understanding about race, right? They don't really understand how race functions quite yet. And here you see that white children are remembering white and those racially mixed faces equally well, which means they're actually thinking of those faces as an in-group, because this is that same other race effect here, because you see that green bar is representing their memory for Black faces, which is much lower. So they're remembering white and ambiguous faces significantly better than how well they're remembering Black faces. But in contrast, once kids gain this more adult-like thinking about race, these white children not only show a huge boost in their ability to remember white faces, but their ability to remember ambiguous faces drops drastically. And now those green and red bars actually don't differ from each other, which means that white children, once they gain this more adult-like thinking about race, remember white or in-group faces very well, and no longer remember ambiguous and Black faces. So this is actually showing that developmental shift of what causes us as adults to apply this one drop rule in deciding someone is an in-group versus an out-group member. And the last thing I'll end with today is developmentally, as I mentioned, college is a super important identity period where our identities are growing and changing all the time. And here at Duke, we've been looking at cross-race roommates on what actually through those diversity exposures can shift how roommates are actually thinking about each other and how this is shifting students' sense of self. We know from the majority of research that cross-race roommates have fewer joint activities together, they spend less time together, but we also know that this exposure to someone who is different than you is decreasing the cross-group anxiety that you might have when you meet someone new for the first time. My own past work shows from grad school at Tufts University that if you are a white freshman and you're randomly assigned to live with an other race roommate. This could be a Black, Asian, or Latino roommate. That experience by the end of your freshman year actually shows huge positive transfer effects. When I bring you to the lab to meet a Black person you've never met before, that interaction goes way better for a white student who had an other race roommate. And that Black student in the interaction also feels much better. So this again is showing that this exposure to diversity is shifting how we think about different social categories. So at Duke, a few years ago, the whole university decided to switch to a completely randomized roommate policy. So we have two different class cohorts. One, the class of 2021, who are graduating this year, who did have a choice. So they could either choose a roommate or they could be randomly assigned. Or the class of 2022, who will graduate next year, all those freshmen were randomly assigned. And so I wanted to see what happens when you have a random roommate versus a chosen roommate as it relates to this diversity gain. So some of the brief results I'll highlight here, and I'm happy to take more questions on this. First, that without a randomized roommate policy, college students are very likely to choose someone exactly like themselves. Same hometown, same race, same socioeconomic status, same language backgrounds. You're really picking someone exactly like yourself for your freshman year. But when you have a randomized roommate policy in place, you're much more likely to have someone from a different race, sexual orientation, or religious group background. And this added exposure to all of these different social categories, again, across your first year of college, which is such an important identity development period, leads to more honest and easier discussions about diversity. Students are showing that they can more easily have these types of conversations compared to students who chose their roommates. We also see more flexible perceptions of group membership. So the same essentialism is what we've measured with our college students. And you find that if you, again, have this added exposure to people who are different, it's expanding our sense of self, which is also expanding the different social categories and social identities these students are claiming too. And finally, one of the findings that I'm really excited about is students are also self-reporting having a significantly more diverse set of friends. Again, this forced exposure, their first semester of college, is really expanding their horizons on making sure that their friend group is as inclusive and as representative as possible. So I'm really excited to see how these results turn out, although COVID has sort of ruined a lot of my roommate tracking abilities this year at Duke, but we're going to do the best that we can with the data that we have. So I just wanted to end with a quote from Erik Erikson, who is a really famous, incredible developmental psychologist who's really responsible for thinking about all of the developmental stages that kids are going through as they learn about themselves. He wrote, "Throughout infancy and childhood, a person forms many identifications. This turning point in human development seems to be the reconciliation between the person one has come to be and the person society expects one to become. This emerging sense of self will be established by forging past experiences with anticipations of the future." And so again, that question of what age point is the most important, those critical periods are the ones I outlined, but really over time, you're going to be seeing different forms of identities and different experiences of identities based on where you move, based on where you live, based on the classroom makeup. All of those things are going to shift what's salient to your child at one given point versus another. My last little public service announcement is we are currently recruiting kids for 2 different online study opportunities. So in case any of you listening have a child between the ages of 3 and 8 years, or a boy between the ages of 10 to 14 years, we are doing some paid studies. They're all virtual, of course. So I do encourage you to email us at dukeidlab@gmail.com. We have a Duke Identity and Diversity Lab, and we'd love to have you participate in one of our future studies. So I'm happy to take questions. I know we have some questions that the panelists will be asking me, but if there are any others, please feel free to put them in the Q&A. And thank you so much for listening.
Dr. Gaither, that's a perfect segue into one of our parent questions. What are the most important things adults can do for children as they explore their identity during adolescence?
Yeah, this is a great question and one that I get asked quite a lot. So the number one thing, which I'm sure many of you will love to hear, is to just not make your child feel like they're forced to choose one identity over the other, right? So that study that I showed with the cortisol spikes, that same cortisol spike happens when you're a young child too. So really allowing your child to explore who they are and what they are. And also importantly, as a parent, if a child decides they don't want a certain identity, it's not okay then as a parent either to say, well, you must identify as X, right? You really need to make sure that all of their identities are freely chosen and to let them feel like themselves. I think the other things you could do is making sure that they're prepared for the types of questions that they're going to be facing. I think based on how they look, I personally was not prepared by my parents on how to deal with questions of, well, your dad's not Black, right? So as a young child in a classroom, I wasn't prepared with the tools or the knowledge on how to deal with those things. So really thinking through what types of things your kid might face, regardless of whatever their identities may be, is another thing I tell parents to focus on a lot.
Nice.
Thanks. We just got a question in the chat for the email for the study volunteers.
Yes, I will type that back in
The chat in a second. And I will look through the other pre-submitted questions, but anybody else, please do feel free to enter some in the Q&A box. So this next question, I believe you touched on near the beginning of your talk, but I would love to hear more. The question is, what advice would you give to multiracial children and their parents who are invited to affinity groups for people of color, particularly around sort of navigating the emotions and sense of belonging or not belonging that might come about when invited to an affinity group?
Yeah, so I think a lot of that's depending on how the child feels about the group. I think it can be a really good first encounter, but you should make sure to ask your kid how it felt being in that group afterwards. Obviously, for someone like myself, I look very white. So going to Black student groups was not a very positive experience for me, just because I did not live the Black experience. I was raised by Black people, but I just did not share all of those qualities, right? And so for me, being in that space was not a very good experience for me, but I found multiracial groups a much better fit. There are many other multiracial and multicultural people, though, who really find their place in those affinity groups. And so I think it really varies person to person. I think it can be a really nice, safe space for students, too, if the rest of their campus or environment is maybe not as inclusive as it should be.
So Dr. Gaither, here's a question about language. How can we best encourage our children to speak the second language without alienating them from doing it around their friends?
Yeah, language is really, really complicated. And we actually have some new work with multiracial adults showing that they all feel really badly now that they didn't learn their heritage languages when they were growing up. So if any of you have young kids watching and you do speak a different language, I would strongly encourage you now to start teaching your kids, because all of our adults are actually really, really regretting the fact that they don't actually have that ability later on. So I think ways of making it exciting, I think there were a few other questions on how to make your kid excited about learning a language if they've maybe lost interest in it. The best piece of advice I've heard from a lot of my linguistic colleagues is to actually start with really fun, active words. And so you actually will jump with your kid and then say the word for jump in whatever language it may be. So using these fun action words, things that they can actually do in practice, is a way to get kids more excited about learning fun words that they can use with their friends. And so even if their other friends don't speak that language, they can say, hey, look at this game, you actually jump and you say this, and you can actually use this as a fun opportunity to share your language and culture with other friends without making it seem alienating. So those fun active words is a really easy way, I think, to get kids a little more engaged with learning a different language.
And we just got another question in the chat. And that question is, how do I help my white biological kids support my adopted Black and biracial children who are being raised by two white parents?
Yeah, that's a complicated question. So there's lots of answers there. I think it depends on what ages the kids are, when they were adopted, right? All of these things are going to matter on sort of what the family dynamics and context is going to be. I think one thing is just making sure that you're using these common words like family, really highlighting those common identities and the common similarities. There's tons of research that shows when you highlight things that are the same between you and other people, it builds that bridge. Another really nice task, particularly for kids who are adopted versus biological, is actually creating new games that are unique to your family. So something new that you all share together can be a nice way to build a bond between kids who are maybe feeling that division between being adopted and biological. So those are some other tactics from some of my colleagues who study transracially adopted and adopted families more broadly. I hope that's helpful.
I have one more. Is there an age where multiple identities might be most difficult for a child to manage?
Yeah, so I think this gets back to, is there a critical age period when identities are the hardest, right? And it really depends again on where you're living and what type of school you're in, because some people might have a great high school experience and other people might not be in a high school that's very inclusive for them. So there's a lot of factors. I do think that adolescence is a really difficult time for kids. That is when people are changing schools and changing friend groups, and those comparisons become very salient to kids on what you're wearing. So there's a lot more factors related to socioeconomic status, how you talk. All of those accent markers end up mattering a lot more during that adolescent period. So if I had to pick one, I guess my money would be on adolescence as being the hardest time for kids to sort of figure out what identities they can claim, and if those are identities that can be safely claimed, depending on what environment they're in.
And another question, and I'd also just like to thank you, Dr. Gaither, for sharing a bit of your personal story. And so this question is, what advice would you give to your adolescent self now about navigating your identity? And hopefully that could help some of our families.
Yeah, I think if I were to go back in time, and granted, I grew up at a different time than all of your kids are, and I'm jealous of all your kids growing up now, because I really do think it's an exciting time to be multiracial. I wish I was prouder of my multiracial heritage. I think really instilling that pride in who it is that I am. I think for me, looking so white and being questioned all the time about my own family structure was a lot for me to process as a kid. And so I never really was sure if I could actually claim a Black identity or not. I remember my PSAT in high school, I got an award in the mail for being a smart Black person, but I remember checking the envelope to see if there was one for being a smart white person, and I didn't get one. And it was this salient moment to me in high school that even though I knew I was biracial my whole life, half my toys were white, half my toys were Black, right? I knew these things about myself, but that's this very prominent memory in my own mind in high school where I realized, oh, these stereotypes in society are really only affecting half of me and not like I didn't understand then what I do now, right? On sort of how these dual identities can really cause a sense of conflict in oneself. So just figuring out how to love yourself a little more is something that I would have gone back to tell my adolescent self.
Okay. Looks like we have another question in the chat. What about donor kids? My kid's donor is from the Middle East. One of them feels that she is connected to that. How do I address that?
Yeah, I think, you really just want to make sure that you're not closing off any of your kids' identities, right? I think if they're curious about it, I think this also works for adopted kids who end up questioning, they want to know who their biological parents are at some point. These same questions come up between donor kids and adopted kids. Those are good things to make sure that you're not closing the door off with them as a family. You want to be able to allow them to explore who they are, because again, all these negative health outcomes are strongly associated when kids feel like they're being forced to choose something that they don't want to. So I know it might be hard sometimes to endorse certain identities some kids might have, but it's really, really important to make sure that kids really have a lot of autonomy and ownership over developing that sense of self. So that's some advice I would give there.
Another question from prior to the session. Do you think it's possible to hold two cultural identities equally without choosing or preferencing one over the other?
I would say yes, it's possible. I would say it's also more likely, though, that in certain contexts, you're going to feel one of them being more powerful than the other, right? But there's some great work. Veronica Benet-Martinez is an amazing cultural psychologist, and she actually argues that when your bicultural identities are truly integrated, they really see each other in the same way. That's when you're at your positive sense of self. That's when you see high self-esteem. That's when you feel whole as a person. And that for people who don't really integrate their identities, you end up keeping them very separate. You find more of those mental health issues for populations who are really trying to keep them separate. So again, my advice is don't make anyone feel like they have to choose. You can merge them all together, but know that the rest of society is not so good at processing people who are merging these identities together at the same time.
Okay.
Thank you.
It's amazing.
I have my own question. I know I'm a panelist, but I was fascinated watching the videos from the studies themselves. It makes me want to go read about lots of psychology studies. And I was wondering if you heard from the participants, the multiracial participants after their experiences, and sort of what being a part of those studies, how that impacted their life.
Yeah, the identity denial one with the cortisol, there were definitely some people who cried in that study, I'm not going to lie, but they all got paid $30 afterward, which helped a little bit. So most of them were crying only because we, of course, have to debrief all of our participants afterwards and tell them why we did the study, what the study was about. And we would tell the multiracial and the Asian American students in that study what we were trying to measure. They were just so excited to hear that someone was actually studying them, particularly our biracial sample. And we get a lot of this from parents of biracial kids as well. Really, they've been excluded from research today. Usually you're just recruiting white kids or Black kids. Biracial kids, no one ever knows what to do with them. So these really real salient experiences of identity questioning, all of our biracial participants were just so thankful that they were actually being documented, because many people argue without data, whatever you're experiencing can't be real, right? So if there's no health data to sort of show X outcome for multicultural kids, there's no way that we can start creating policies or health changes, right? To acknowledge these kinds of discrepancies that we see. So we normally get very positive reactions for the most part. And then I see that's not a question, but yes, thank you all for being here.
Please feel free to post other questions in the chat as they come up about any of the parts of the presentation, or just questions that you're coming to this session with. Brenda, do you have?
No, no other questions that I'm aware of.
I can ask both of you a question.
Yes, sure. Wow, we would.
And sort of what would you say are some of the tactics that your school has done to sort of embrace multiple identities, like through this committee that you've sort of formed? What are some of the approaches? Maybe the parents listening don't even know all the things that you've been trying, which is one thing that I find schools could do a lot better, is making sure they're aware of all the efforts that they're putting in with their parents. So what things have you all done?
So one thing that we emphasize is just having images around the school and in our club space of individuals who are multiracial, multicultural, multireligious, and making those known. So just today we had a meeting with our students and we showed them multiple celebrities. We had so many, some of them I didn't know, and the kids were naming more, but we talked about Meghan Markle, and we talked about Amanda Bynes, who is multi-faith. We talked about J.K. Rowling, who has multiple socioeconomic backgrounds. And we just feel like the more we can show students images of those people being successful and thriving, that's just really good for them to see those examples. So that's one thing that we do. We also encourage our students to think about their identities and learn how to name them and describe them in the way that they want to. And at the middle school level, that's not something that students always have, like the language to talk about identity. And so it's been really valuable for the kids to learn that it's okay to talk about identity and it's okay to talk about difference, and here are some of the ways that we can. So those are just a couple of examples.
Yeah. Representation's a great thing. I don't think enough schools realize the power that one picture or one clip art image or can really make in a child's identification with school. I was at former President Barack Obama's inauguration. We had tickets to actually be on the National Mall. And I remember sitting in the airport in Washington, D.C., and there was this Latina woman sitting next to me who was sobbing. And I said, "Oh, are you okay?" And she said, "I'm just so happy. I came here to take pictures of inauguration to show my Mexican daughter that she too could be president one day," right? So they weren't even the same racial background, but it was such a strong moment in history, right? To have someone who was brown in the White House, right? And so these representation things are just huge markers for positive identity development.
We also talk a lot about empathy for other cultures and races, and kind of putting yourself in other people's shoes. and appreciate, as well as appreciating your own identity. We touch on stereotypes, and we just want them to be, have the full sense of self.
We had the students make a video compilation of themselves holding signs. And so on the front of the sign, it said, I am, and then one of their cultural identifiers, like I am Muslim, or I am the youngest sibling, some kind of identifier. And then on the back, they put what they are not. And that was a stereotype associated with that identifier. And so then we mashed up all of those videos, put some music to it, and it ended up being a really powerful sort of 2-minute reminder of how, yes, identity is really important to us and to society, but also that we are many things and that we defy and we transcend the boxes that we're put into. So that was another thing that we did. I had a thought as you were talking about Barack Obama, and I was wondering if you're familiar with any research regarding perhaps multiracial or cross-cultural politicians,
Mhm.
and if they might actually find some success. I'm thinking about this idea of code switching and being able to relate to multiple communities.
Yeah, a lot of people equate some of former President Barack Obama's success to the fact that he can code switch between his biracial backgrounds. So there's tons of videos of him being at historically Black churches versus white churches, right? And he literally switches how he talks. So those types of perspective taking, empathy, right, are things that a lot of people wrote about. I ran a study pre and post Obama's reelection, actually, and found that before the reelection, white people actually thought he was too Black and Black people thought he was too white. But after the reelection, so when he won, white people thought he was plenty white and Black people thought he was plenty Black. And this is something we call in psychology as burging, or basking in reflective glory. So when a member of your team wins, you love that team and you really claim them hard. But when they don't win, you're like, there's always next season, right? And so going into the election cycle, we find that for multicultural candidates, depending on what office they're running for and what the time is, people are going to see them as more and less similar to themselves. Kamala Harris is another really good current example, wherein she was running for president. Many people did not think she was Black enough at all. But now that she has the vice president nomination, we find the shift where now many Black people are actually claiming her again as part of the Black community much more strongly than when she was running for president. And her South Asian heritage has been, many people have argued already from Pew data that the Indian American community has been voting more than ever before. So again, people just want to see their identities represented. And so I do think multicultural candidates can bridge certain types of gaps that we haven't seen otherwise.
What was that acronym? I think that phrase you used, basking in the reflective
glory. Yeah, burging.
Oh, burging. Okay.
Yes,
yeah.
Burging, basking in reflective glory. Very pertinent for election day on Tuesday. They find whoever wins, those yard signs, of course, stay up significantly longer than whoever loses, right? So those are the other markers for your election day fun on Tuesday.
Well, I don't see any other questions. I hate for a session to end. I've really learned so much. Dr. Gaither, thank you so much for doing this very, very important research. I speak from the heart. So most of the time when I see you, I'm smiling broadly because I know you've kind of creating the will, and I just really appreciate what you're doing. And thanks for giving us the dialogue that's necessary to continue this conversation. I also want to take a quick minute to thank Cheryl Allen. She's the middle school dean. She realized the importance of this conversation. We are so busy with the transition from learning from home to learning on campus, but Cheryl kind of took the wheel and made sure to see that Dr. Gaither was able to visit with us. And so thanks so much to Cheryl for her countless emails, attention to detail, and passion for this work. Because of her, this event was possible. So in the midst of our busyness, we remain focused on thriving, not just surviving. and we can't lose focus of our students' social and emotional journey. At this time, more than ever, we want to focus on their well-being. So
And yes,
if
you can
there,
all
I
follow
hate
me
to
on
interrupt,
Twitter.
but yeah, we just had someone ask, and I saw your Twitter handle,
I just
Dr. Gaither, but I
responded to
forget what it
that
was.
one.
Okay, awesome,
So yeah,
awesome.
my Twitter handle is at Sarah E. Gaither, because Sarah Gaither was already taken when I joined. So my middle initial E is in there. So please follow me on Twitter. And for those of you parents who are watching the recording, you can always email me other questions you have after watching this, since I know you weren't able to be here live. So I'm always on email all the time, like everyone is now in our strange COVID world. So
yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Gaither, and thank you to everybody who attended this chat. We just had someone else say this is important work for our kids, all of our kids. Thank you for all that you do.
thank you all for your questions and for raising wonderful future adult human beings. So
have a great night.
Thank you.